A peaceful night in a small American town shattered when the father vanished without a trace. The mother trembled, too afraid to speak, and the only child who witnessed everything ran off into the darkness. Strange clues. From a Polaroid photo to a trail along Route 417 pulled the police into a journey to uncover the secrets this family had been hiding for years. And when the truth finally surfaced, it left everyone who heard it in stunned silence. If you want to know the twist that changed the entire town's story, watch until the end and follow so you won't miss the truths hiding behind every brightly lit door. I still remember that morning as clearly as if someone had carved it into my memory with an icy blade. Lakewell was known for its gentle sunrises, the light spilling across the lake and slipping through the old wooden window frames. Everything was usually so peaceful that people believed the town was protected by the kindness of its own community. But that morning, my phone buzzed at 6:30, shattering the quiet I had always taken for granted. On the other end of the line was the sheriff. He said the name of Emily Harper, the girl who lived 2 houses to the right. Emily had gone missing since midnight. I froze in the kitchen, my hands trembling as I set my mug down on the wooden counter. The coffee maker dripped slowly, each drop echoing like a countdown against my heartbeat. Emily was the kind of person you'd never imagine something bad could happen to. She worked at the town library, baked apple pies, and smiled at anyone who happened to walk past her. No one could picture her being pulled into something this dark. When I stepped out onto my porch, Maple Drive, normally quiet, was packed with people. Neighbors clustered in small groups outside Emily's lawn. Louise, who lived across from me, hugged her shaking arms and kept shaking her head. She said she heard a car door slam late last night, but when she looked outside, there was no one there. A tiny detail, maybe, but right now, it was like a match struck against the town's growing fear. Police had taped off the area around Emily's house. Through the yellow line, I could see her small home still as neat as ever. No signs of struggle, nothing knocked over. Her phone still plugged in on the table, her wallet lying flat beside the window. Everything looked frozen in time, except for the one person missing from it. I overheard a young officer say the back door hadn't been locked. That was strange, because Emily was always careful. She once told me she never left the back door open, not even when she stepped out for a few minutes to water the flowers. Another detail that seemed small, yet it made the whole town go rigid. Who had entered that house in silence? Who had made Emily leave without a trace? A sense of unease crept through us like morning fog, seeping into every street corner. I looked around, seeing the same heavy expression on everyone's faces. It wasn't just fear for Emily. It was the realization that something deeply wrong was moving among us, right here, in the same streets where every kid in this town once played without fear. In Lakewell, people believed in familiarity. We believed that if someone were in danger, a neighbor would hear it and would rush over. But the thing that terrified people most was the silence. Emily disappeared without a cry for help, without a sign of struggle, without anyone hearing a thing, as if she'd been swallowed whole by the darkness surrounding this town. I stepped back and looked toward the tall, dark yew trees at the end of the street. They stood there, unmoving, as if watching the chaos unfold. Something about them made my spine prickle, a primitive, instinctive feeling, as if they had been standing there through the whole story, witnessing everything, yet saying nothing. And in that moment, I felt something press against my chest. It wasn't the wind, it was instinct. A clear, sharp intuition that made me hold my breath. That Emily's disappearance wasn't the beginning. It was a warning, and whatever was coming for all of us would reach far beyond anything a small town like Lakewell had ever faced. At a glance, many might think Emily Harper was just an ordinary girl living in a quiet American town, but anyone who had ever spoken to her, even once, walked away feeling as though they were carrying a bit of sunlight in their palms. Emily wasn't beautiful in the dazzling, head-turning way. She made people feel safe, and that kind of presence was rare in a place like Lakewell, where everyone tried to hide their loneliness behind polite smiles. Emily lived alone in a white wooden house at the end of Maple Drive. It wasn't large, but every afternoon when the sun sank low, the golden light brushed the windows and made the place look like something pulled straight out of an American autumn painting. Her front yard was lined with hydrangeas she tended herself. Mrs. Louise once said even the flowers seemed to bloom a little brighter whenever Emily stood near them. She had a gentleness about her that made everything around her feel calm. Her daily job was at the Lakewell Library. It was a red brick building from the 1942nd, carrying the scent of old paper and lingering pinewood from wartime construction. Emily loved that library as if it were a part of her own life. Every morning she unlocked the doors early, wiped down each shelf, rearranged books placed in the wrong spot, and left little handwritten notes for readers. Those papers often held warm quotes, small reminders of the kindness Emily wanted to offer the town, that the world still had tenderness in it. Because she worked at the library, Emily knew nearly everyone in Lakewell. Children adored her because she read stories to them every Friday night. The elderly loved her because she remembered every book they borrowed, their preferences, their quirks. No one understood the rhythms of Lakewell better than Emily. And that was why her disappearance shook the town so deeply. When someone like Emily goes missing, it isn't just bad news. It's a fracture in the community's sense of trust. Emily had been born into a family not entirely happy, but warm enough for her to learn what love looked like. Her father was a quiet carpenter with rough hands. Her mother worked at the health clinic, always putting others before herself. They died young in a car accident when Emily was 19. Since then, she lived alone, building for herself a small world filled with light. Perhaps that loss was what taught her to treat others so gently. She understood what loneliness looked like. She didn't want anyone else to feel it. I once asked Emily if she ever felt sad living by herself. She smiled a soft smile, like the warm yellow glow spilling from her windows each evening. She said she did feel sad sometimes, but not because she was lonely. It was because so many things in this world went unheard, unshared. The way Emily lived was so simple that people often forgot she too had big dreams. She wanted to publish a picture book for children about fireflies who lost their way and tried to find their way home. She wanted to buy an old pickup truck and drive across state lines, visiting towns no one had ever heard of. But Emily never told those dreams to anyone except a few close friends, simply because she believed her dreams weren't as important as listening to others. What made everyone love Emily was the way she noticed beauty in the things people usually overlooked. On the road leading to the library, she always stopped to pick up a few fallen leaves with interesting shapes. When she saw a stranger hesitating outside the general store, she would walk over and ask if they needed a hand. She was the kind of person who could meet you once and still leave something gently altered inside you, like a thin layer of ice beginning to thaw. On winter nights, when snow blanketed the streets and the streetlights flickered, Emily often sat by her window, wrapped in a pale blue scarf. She would write in her journal and drink peppermint tea. I could see her silhouette against the curtain, small but serene. For reasons I could never explain, every time I saw that image, I felt like the town was safer, as if as long as Emily was here, Lakewell could maintain its fragile warmth. And yet now she was gone, taking with her a light no one knew how to replace. The police questioned everyone, but no one could name a single person who disliked Emily. No one could recall a moment when she looked frightened or unsettled. She owed no debts, had no conflicts, no grudges. Her disappearance felt like a jagged tear ripped through the town's daily life. It made people realize that sometimes the ones hurt the most are precisely those who spend their lives being good. In the nights that followed, every time I looked at Emily's empty house, a tightness gripped my chest. The light no longer flicked on at 6 in the evening. There were no curtains drawn, no small figure moving back and forth in the living room. The house stood there, silent, as though it too were waiting for her to return. Emily wasn't just a victim. She was the soul of this town. And her disappearance wasn't merely an incident. It was a wound the entire community now carried. And it was the reason we couldn't give up. We couldn't let Emily's story slip into the dark again. What haunted me most was the thought that in the moment Emily stepped out of her familiar life, none of us recognized the signs. No one heard a cry for help. No one noticed the darkness creeping so close to her small but warm world. And that was why the day she went missing became a lingering obsession, a blurred film playing over and over in my mind. That morning had started like any other. Emily arrived at the library at 10 minutes to 8. The security camera at the gate caught her stepping off her mint green bicycle, the one she loved so much. She wore a brown knit coat, her hair tied neatly, her cheeks flushed from the early winter chill. She greeted Mr. Willis, the keeper of the old archives, with a smile that people would later say was the last time they ever saw real light on her face. Around 10 in the morning, someone recalled seeing Emily in the children's section. She was reading to a group of third graders from Lakewell Elementary. One teacher said she seemed completely normal, not tired, not anxious, nothing unusual at all. She read with a warm voice that kept the kids silent, drawn into the story as if she were casting a spell. No one could have imagined that just a few hours later, Emily would vanish. Around 12:20 p.m., Emily left the library to buy a sandwich at the Johnson family's small diner. The owner said she ordered the roasted chicken sandwich and added a peanut butter cookie, just like she always did. Emily asked about the owner's health and reminded her to bring a scarf because the weather was about to turn cold. Those small gestures proved she was still herself, kind, attentive, showing no signs of the fear that seemed to be closing in around her. Around 3 in the afternoon, Emily responded to a work email from the Central Library. That was the last confirmed evidence of her being inside the building. After 3:15 p.m., no camera captured her. No one knew if she met someone. This confused the police. The library wasn't large. There were 4 exits, yet none of them recorded her walking out. By 5 o'clock, the library closed as usual. The doors were locked. The lights were off. But Emily's bicycle was still parked in its familiar spot. That detail sends a chill down my spine every time I think about it. Emily never left her bike behind. It was her only transportation to work, to the market, to visit friends. But that day, it stood there, waiting for its owner to return. And she never did. From about 5 to 7 in the evening, the timeline became blurry. No one knew where Emily was, what she was doing, or who she might have met. The police called it the empty window, a dark gap in broad daylight. No witnesses, no cameras, no trace. Mrs. Louise, who lived near Emily's house, said that around 7:20 p.m., she heard soft footsteps outside. She thought it was Emily because the steps were familiar, light and steady. But when she looked out the window, the street was completely dark. Emily's curtains were still drawn. Her lights were off. There was no figure standing at her door. Emily's curtains, there was Karn dressed of lichen. A man living 3 blocks away reported seeing a black pickup truck driving slowly down Maple Drive at about 5 minutes to 8. He said it seemed like the driver was looking for someone or watching the area. The truck didn't stop. It rolled off the street and disappeared within seconds. What frightened the townspeople was that several of them believed they had seen that same truck before appearing at odd hours when no one should have been out roaming the streets. The back door of Emily's house was found unlocked. This was the strangest detail in the entire case. Emily always locked her doors. She once said that a peaceful town didn't mean there was no danger. But that night, the back door sat still and slightly open, as if inviting the darkness inside. Around 8:30 p.m., neighbors heard a faint sound coming from Emily's backyard. Something like someone kicking a trash bin or stepping on a dry branch. A sound so small that no one bothered to check. But the result of that neglect was an entire town living in fear for days afterward. No one knows what that sound truly was. But there is a chilling certainty that it was the last moment Emily still existed in this world. Emily's phone was found on the table by the living room window. The screen showed no missed calls and no new messages. Everything looked as if it had been frozen at the exact moment she stepped out of the house. Her wallet was still full, nothing missing. A wool scarf was draped over the back of a chair, and Emily's journal lay open on the table. The last line written the night before. No signs of disturbance. No signs of a struggle. No trace of anyone else. Police suggested that Emily might have left the house quietly for some unexpected reason. But what reason would make someone as cautious as Emily leave behind her phone, her wallet, and even her coat on a cold night? What could have pulled her away from the safest place she knew? And more importantly, who was capable of making her do that? When I stood on her porch after nightfall, a strange feeling tightened in my chest. Every object sat exactly where it always had, but none of it carried her warmth anymore. No chair scraping softly against the floor. No lamplight spilling through the window. Only an absence so heavy it made my ribs ache. The night Emily disappeared carried no scream. No pounding at the door. No signs of violence. But sometimes, silence is the most terrifying thing of all. It seeps through every crack like invisible smoke, leaving everyone with the haunting sense that we missed something important, as if the answer had been sitting in plain sight, but none of us were brave enough to face it. And that is what makes Emily's disappearance so painful. Not the things we know, but the things we don't. And the fear that the truth might be darker than anything we could imagine. When police began searching Emily's home the next morning, I stood outside the white wooden fence, peering through the thin gaps as if trying to catch the last bit of warmth left in that house. No one was prepared for the emptiness settling over everything. The house wasn't just quiet. It felt wounded. A kind of invisible grief spread through every corner, every chair, every object she once touched. The officers opened the front door. The dry creak of the hinges shattered the fragile silence, making the air feel even heavier. Morning light spilled into the living room, revealing a space preserved in exact detail, as if Emily had only stepped out for a short breath of fresh air. And yet her absence made everything feel uncanny and wrong. The first thing that caught their attention was the pale blue scarf draped over the chair. I remembered how Emily wore it every night while reading. On a cold night like that, the fact that it was still here, soft, and still felt like a quiet warning that she had left in a hurry. On the table by the window, her journal lay open. The last line was written in her soft, slanted handwriting. But something was off. The pen had been left leaning sideways, touching the edge of the notebook. Emily was meticulous. She never left her pen out of place. The police called it an unusual detail. The kitchen was where things hit us the hardest. Many people said that cup was the last calm moment of Emily's life, that when she set it down, she had no idea her whole world was about to be crushed. The refrigerator door was left slightly open, as if she had grabbed something and forgotten to close it. That wasn't like Emily at all. She was careful with every little thing. Everyone in town knew that, and that tiny inconsistency sent a chill through all of us. Near the back door, detectives found a faint footprint. No one could tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. No one could tell how long it had been there. But the most unsettling part was its position right next to where Emily's coat hung. On a cold night like that, Emily would never walk outside without her coat. That detail opened up a possibility that made everyone's chest tighten. Maybe Emily didn't walk out on her own. Maybe someone came, and that someone forced her to leave before she could prepare or protect herself. When they opened the back door, the light fell across patches of soft soil that had been recently stepped on. There were faint drag-like marks, as if something had been pulled, or someone had tried to walk quietly enough to avoid making a sound. When Mrs. Louise heard that, she broke down in tears. She said she had heard something that night, a tiny noise she'd dismissed, a sound she now wished she had paid attention to. Another piece of evidence sent a shiver through everyone. A small folded paper tucked under the doormat by the back door. A corner of it peeked out just enough to draw attention. When officers pulled it out, everyone held their breath. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a note. Just a blank sheet of paper, folded in half. Inside, nothing. No writing, no marks. But in the center, there was a strange crease, like someone had pinched it tightly between their fingers, hesitated, and then left it behind as a half-finished message with no clear meaning. One officer said it could have just been a piece of scrap paper, and that lone piece of paper made the house that once felt warm suddenly feel foreign, like it belonged to someone else. In the bedroom, the sheets were smooth. The bedside lamp was off. The book she'd been reading rested neatly on the nightstand. But the small drawer beside the bed was open just a few inches. Not fully open, just cracked, as if someone had opened it and pushed it back in a hurry. Emily never did anything halfway. That caught the officer's attention. Inside that drawer were the things Emily treasured most: a family photograph, a wooden bracelet carved by her father from maple, and a small silver key. She never said what that key opened, but strangely enough, it wasn't in the drawer that night. It had vanished, just like Emily. Outside, near the backyard fence, officers found a small piece of fabric caught on a low branch. The color looked similar to the sweater she wore that morning at the library. Early analysis couldn't confirm if it belonged to her, but the fact that it was there, on the night she disappeared, was enough to keep the entire town awake. Every piece of evidence was small. No blood, no clear traces, no message. Just enough disturbance for someone to overlook, yet enough to weigh heavily on the hearts of those who loved her. A home once filled with Emily's light now held dozens of questions no one could answer. The cruelest part was that nothing at the scene suggested Emily had fought back. No sign she had tried to call for help, as if everything had unfolded so quietly that even she realized it only when it was already too late. The house witnessed Emily's final moments. But all it told us was that she disappeared. Not why, not with whom. And that was what made the case suffocatingly terrifying. Not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. And the sight of her house glowing warm every evening now lived only as a painful reminder that sometimes darkness doesn't fall with a sound. It falls with perfect silence. Though the pieces collected at the scene had already shaken the peaceful town, they were only the first half of the storm, when investigators began narrowing down the people who might be connected to Emily's disappearance. Familiar faces were gradually called out. Each one carried a fragment of darkness they tried to hide behind everyday smiles. And that made everything heavier, as if no one could be sure anymore whether they truly knew anyone in this town. The first suspect was Mark, the boyfriend who had been with Emily for nearly 3 years. He was known as gentle, quiet, a bit withdrawn. But when police brought up the argument the two had the night before, Mark lost the calm he was known for. He denied hurting Emily, but he didn't deny the heated fight about their future. His eyes flooded with regret whenever he said her name, but beneath that, there was something unreadable, like a thick fog he refused to explain. Next was Sarah, Emily's closest friend since high school. Sarah was the bright, energetic type, but sometimes brightness hides the deepest cracks. When asked about the last time she saw Emily, Sarah answered clearly, but her hands were clenched tightly, as if trying to crush her own worry. Some said the two had grown distant before Emily disappeared. Rumor had it that Sarah envied Emily's growing success. No one knew how true that was, but it was enough to place Sarah on the list. Investigators also questioned Mr. Tom, the elderly neighbor living across the street. He was the kind of man everyone called friendly, though a little too interested in other people's business. Neighbors said he was the last person who saw Emily walking home after her shift. When asked, he said he stood at a distance, watching her walk into her yard, and saw nothing strange. But his eyes dodged every question, as if the truth was hiding in the shadows behind him. Another name they couldn't ignore was David, the coworker at the cafe. He had feelings for Emily, even if he never said it out loud. People often teased. David always looked at Emily a little longer than normal whenever she walked into the room. When news of her disappearance spread, David became visibly frantic. So frantic that many felt his reaction was a bit too much. He insisted he had been home alone that night, with no one to verify it. And that very absence of proof made David a highly suspicious name on the list. Also included was Linda, the owner of the cafe where Emily worked. Linda was a strong-willed woman, somewhat strict. Everyone in town knew she had raised her voice at Emily the week before over a minor incident at the shop. Though Linda claimed she cared for Emily like family, their recent tension meant she couldn't be dismissed from suspicion. When asked about the night of the incident, Linda said she had closed the cafe early and stayed home watching TV. No one could confirm her story. And then came the most surprising name: Alex, Emily's half-brother, the one she rarely mentioned. Alex had returned to town just 2 weeks earlier, carrying an old duffel bag and a shadow of secrets Emily had never shared with anyone. Neighbors said they had seen the siblings arguing in the yard on the very day Emily disappeared. No one heard what they said, but Emily's mouth seemed to repeat the same word over and over: enough. The sight left many wondering whether Alex was connected to the uneasiness Emily carried before she vanished. The police ruled out nothing. They knew someone could appear ordinary their entire life, yet one moment of weakness or anger could push them into doing something no one would expect. And in this seemingly peaceful town, those 5 familiar people suddenly became 5 looming question marks, each with Emily's shadow standing behind it, waiting for an answer. One by one, the names were placed on the table. Every statement was carefully recorded. But the more the investigators gathered, the more tangled everything became. Like a half-woven tapestry abandoned mid-stitch. No one could tell which thread was truth and which was meant to mislead. Only one thing was certain. Among those 5 or someone else unseen, one person was carrying the biggest secret of all. The secret of Emily's final moments. Those names still lingered in the heavy air of the town as the police began reconstructing the entire investigation timeline. Each suspect was called into the interrogation room, where cold white lights shone straight down on their faces, exposing every small movement their words couldn't hide. Time slowed, as if someone were gripping each second and stretching it, prolonging the tension that refused to break. And with every witness, the truth seemed to take another step backward. The first person brought in was Mark. The room thickened the moment he entered. Mark sat upright, his hands interlocked under the table. He admitted the argument had pushed him over the edge, but insisted he had left Emily's house right afterward and gone straight back to his apartment. When investigators asked for phone location data from that night, Mark said his phone had died in the afternoon. The answer caused the room to deflate. Sarah was next. She showed up looking as polished as always, but her eyes lacked their usual light. She spoke more than Mark did, every sentence clear, yet she couldn't hide the fear threading through each hesitant pause. She said she had been home that night, preparing her lesson for the next morning. But when detectives asked about the recent tension between her and Emily, Sarah stayed silent a little too long. In the end, she softly said that friends sometimes grow distant, but never enough for her to hurt Emily. That delay in her answer left a quiet trace of suspicion lingering over the interrogation table like a shadow that refused to fade. Mr. Tom entered the interrogation room trembling. But the more he talked, the more detectives noticed contradictions between his first statement and the next. When he mentioned seeing Emily return home, his eyes darted away, as if something about that moment in his memory wasn't quite whole. Even so, the police still didn't have a solid reason to conclude he was lying. And so Mr. Tom drifted into the list of possible suspects simply because he knew too much, or maybe because he knew too little. David walked in looking shattered. He immediately admitted he was extremely worried, that he cared for Emily more than he ever showed. That alone caught the detective's attention. But when they asked about the night she disappeared, David couldn't provide anything concrete. He said he stayed home all evening, losing track of time entirely. No one could verify his claim. Yet there was something in his voice that made the room soften, not guilt, but despair. As if he believed he had failed to protect the girl he had quietly watched over for so long. Linda was the complete opposite. She entered the room with the firm composure of someone treating this like another routine inspection at her cafe. She answered each question briefly and clearly, without a flicker of emotion. People like Linda often made interrogations harder, not because they were lying, but because they were too good at hiding how they felt. When detectives asked about her recent conflict with Emily, Linda said it was nothing, that she cared for Emily like family. But her eyes briefly shifted away just 1 second. Yet that 1 second was enough to open a new branch of doubt. And finally, Alex. The half-brother Emily rarely mentioned. Alex sat down like he had known rooms like this his whole life. He spoke little, stayed on topic, but not a single word carried warmth. When detectives asked about the argument between him and Emily on the day she disappeared, Alex simply said it was a family matter. His voice was calm to the point of coldness. What unsettled the detectives wasn't the lack of detail. It was the sense that he had built a wall too high, too solid, blocking anyone from seeing what was behind it. The days that followed became a cycle of hope and disappointment. Clues appeared only to fade, like tiny sparks swallowed by a vast night. A statement that seemed convincing was undone by a detail from a neighbor's security camera. A new witness surfaced only to lead the investigation into another dead end. Detectives raced against time while the entire town held its breath in fear. Every timeline was reconstructed, every movement traced, yet the truth kept slipping away as if it were deliberately twisting itself, hiding the final story that only Emily truly knew. And as the investigative timeline stretched longer and longer, everyone realized one thing. This disappearance wasn't simple. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't an accident. It was a mystery, slowly revealing layers far darker than anyone expected. Someone out there was hiding something the entire town wasn't ready to hear. But the police knew they couldn't stop. Somewhere among those seemingly honest statements was a story waiting to be peeled open. A truth waiting to be called by its real name. After days of repetitive interrogations and collapsing theories, just when it seemed Emily's case was slipping into deadlock, something unexpected happened. The police were rechecking the scene for the third time when a young officer named Miller noticed a small object caught on the back fence, blown there by the wind. It was a Polaroid photo, its corner smeared with dirt, but what made everyone lose their breath was the image at the center. It was Emily. She was standing beside a car door, her eyes looking straight into the lens. The expression on her face wasn't clear. Fear it was caution, as if she knew someone was watching her. Behind her stretched a narrow dirt path, trees casting shadows across the ground. No one recognized where it was, but on the edge of the photo was a faint timestamp, matching the exact hour she disappeared. The discovery shattered every previous assumption. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a rash decision. It was a moment of movement, and Emily had been led away on her own 2 feet. What chilled the police even more was where the Polaroid had been found. Not in the house. Not in her room. Not in her wallet. It was outside, as if dropped while someone was trying to hide it. Or, worse, as if someone had left it there on purpose. When the forensics team enhanced the image, more hidden details appeared. A small marker behind Emily. A fragment of a green road sign partly obscured by branches. And in the lower corner, a streak of light the kind produced by the old street lamps lining Route 417. Just a few clues, but enough for anyone in Lakewell to understand. Route 417 was the narrow road cutting through the woods, connecting the town to the northern outskirts. Few people drove it at night. It was dark, empty, and surrounded by trees on both sides. It was the kind of place where if someone vanished, no one would hear a thing. Detectives immediately pulled traffic footage from the nearest checkpoint on 417. A silver-gray car appeared at the exact timestamp printed on the Polaroid. It was moving slower than usual, as if the driver was hesitating or waiting. Most of the license plate was covered in mud, but the car model was unmistakable. And what left the whole room silent was the coincidence. It was the same model owned by someone the police had interrogated just the day before. No one spoke, but the silence in the briefing room grew so heavy it seemed loud enough to hear every breath. Lakewell was used to small secrets, harmless lies that faded with time. But this clue was different. This wasn't just a photo. It was a doorway, one leading straight into a truth no one wanted to face. Emily's Polaroid proved she was still alive when she left the house. The Route 417 traffic camera proved someone took her there. And now, the question was no longer who could have done it, but who was calm enough to take a picture like that before vanishing with the victim. The police tightened the scope of their investigation, turning their attention back to the person who owned that car. But deep down, everyone understood one thing. Once the truth steps out of the dark, it never stops with just one clue. It drags everyone further in toward the oldest, deepest secrets this town had been burying for years. The Polaroid and Route 417 didn't just open a new direction for the investigation. They forced the detectives to rebuild the psychological profile of both Emily and every suspect on the list. That photo showed an Emily who wasn't collapsing. She wasn't panicking. She stood there with her eyes wide open, alert, but clear-headed. This caught the attention of the behavioral specialist on the team. A person being threatened usually panics or hides their face. Emily didn't. She stared straight into the lens, as if she was trying to send a message. It spoke of a quiet strength, a strength the town knew she had, but never truly understood. Her psychological profile showed she was the kind of person who stayed brave under pressure. She didn't trust easily, but when she did, she trusted deeply. She listened well, and she withdrew when she needed to. This explained why her expression in the Polaroid didn't show helpless fear. It looked more like a temporary strategy, as if she was trying to stall for time, or observe someone standing very close to her. That led investigators to a new possibility. Emily knew the person who approached her that night, and because she knew them, she didn't see them as a threat, at least not at first. When it came to profiling the suspects, the picture became even more complicated. Mark was explosive and emotional, but he lacked patience. He was hot-headed, but straightforward, someone who might yell, argue, or act impulsively. But people like him were rarely calm enough to stage a controlled encounter, photograph a victim, and guide her down a deserted road like Route 417. Still, the moments he lost control made it impossible for detectives to cross him off the list. Sarah was the opposite, introverted, withdrawn, the kind who hid hurt inside. But her personality also suggested she would struggle to force Emily into a car in a direct confrontation. She might have been wounded by their fractured friendship, but she wasn't the type to plan harm. Mr. Tom was the most unstable. Psychological analysis placed him in the category of anxious, imaginative individuals, people who unintentionally create gaps in their own memories. It made him suspicious, but it also made him unlikely to execute a calculated act like the one in the Polaroid. That photo showed control, precision, cold intention, none of which matched him. David was different. His file described a quiet soul, someone who kept distance from the world. His feelings for Emily made him vulnerable, sometimes irrational. But men like David tended to fall apart under stress. They didn't maintain a flawless sequence of actions. Picking Emily up, driving her onto Route 417, and then disappearing from every camera afterward. His heart was softer than his appearance suggested. Linda carried the quiet aura of someone who had lived enough to collect multiple layers of emotion beneath a calm exterior. Her psychological profile described her as disciplined, orderly in her thinking, but also as someone who could be easily hurt if she felt her place was threatened. That made Linda both harmless and dangerous at the same time. Yet to appear in a Polaroid, to stand behind the camera, to keep her breathing steady, that required a different kind of mind, more patient, colder. But the person who made the psychological expert pause the longest was Alex. The type who lived withdrawn, shared little, always ready to build walls around himself. People like Alex could control their emotions to the point of appearing icy. They didn't show stress, nor did they show anger. If conflict existed, they would bury it beneath absolute silence. And silence was sometimes more dangerous than an outburst. What worried the expert most was that someone like Alex had the patience to make a harmful decision and the clarity to leave almost no trace behind. When the psychological profiles were placed next to the Polaroid en route 417, a clearer picture began to form. Not everyone on the list fit the level of control required to take that photo. And not everyone had a bond with Emily deep enough that she wouldn't resist. The photograph was a psychological slice. It told the police that whoever took it was not a stranger, not in a rush, not panicked. The person knew Emily. And Emily knew the person. The case suddenly shifted. It was no longer about where or when. It became a question of the mind and of motive. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't lie in physical evidence. It lies in the way people look at each other, in silence, in the things left unsaid. The air inside the police department's briefing room thickened when the updated investigation file was placed on the table. Everything the agents had been trying to string together now started emitting an invisible sound, like the cracking of a truth refusing to stay buried beneath the dust of stories crafted too perfectly. And there, beneath the harsh white lights that made everyone feel small, stood the image of two people being forced to confront the darkest parts of themselves, the parts they had kept hidden, even from their own minds. Agent Monroe opened the first folder. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to change the rhythm of the room. The new evidence came from a device found in the Hudson garage, an old security camera disguised behind a tool shelf. It belonged to the husband. And what mattered most was that its internal memory had recorded more than his wife ever knew. Not just ordinary surveillance footage, but proof that he had been watching her for months, from seemingly harmless phone calls to private moments in which any woman would feel robbed of the right to breathe. When the police played the most critical video, the room fell silent. His face twisted with rage, his eyes burning through anything he saw as a threat to his control. But what sent chills down everyone's spine was the isolated audio, a single sentence from him, rasped out with enough weight to pull every suspicion into a long, buried spiral of violence. The husband immediately objected, slamming his hand on the table as if he wanted to break it. He said it was just a misunderstanding, a moment of losing control, something not enough to condemn a man once seen as. Linda carried the quiet aura of someone who had lived enough to collect multiple layers of emotion beneath a calm exterior. Her psychological profile described her as disciplined, orderly in her thinking, but also as someone who could be easily hurt if she felt her place was threatened. That made Linda both harmless and dangerous at the same time. Yet to appear in a Polaroid, to stand behind the camera, to keep her breathing steady, that required a different kind of mind, more patient, colder. But the person who made the psychological expert pause the longest was Alex. The type who lived withdrawn, shared little, always ready to build walls around himself. People like Alex could control their emotions to the point of appearing icy. They didn't show stress, nor did they show anger. If conflict existed, they would bury it beneath absolute silence. And silence was sometimes more dangerous than an outburst. What worried the expert most was that someone like Alex had the patience to make a harmful decision and the clarity to leave almost no trace behind. When the psychological profiles were placed next to the Polaroid en route 417, a clearer picture began to form. Not everyone on the list fit the level of control required to take that photo. And not everyone had a bond with Emily deep enough that she wouldn't resist. The photograph was a psychological slice. It told the police that whoever took it was not a stranger, not in a rush, not panicked. The person knew Emily. And Emily knew the person. The case suddenly shifted. It was no longer about where or when. It became a question of the mind and of motive. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't lie in physical evidence. It lies in the way people look at each other, in silence, in the things left unsaid. The air inside the police department's briefing room thickened when the updated investigation file was placed on the table. Everything the agents had been trying to string together now started emitting an invisible sound, like the cracking of a truth refusing to stay buried beneath the dust of stories crafted too perfectly. And there, beneath the harsh white lights that made everyone feel small, stood the image of two people being forced to confront the darkest parts of themselves, the parts they had kept hidden, even from their own minds. Agent Monroe opened the first folder. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to change the rhythm of the room. The new evidence came from a device found in the Hudson garage, an old security camera disguised behind a tool shelf. It belonged to the husband. And what mattered most was that its internal memory had recorded more than his wife ever knew. Not just ordinary surveillance footage, but proof that he had been watching her for months, from seemingly harmless phone calls to private moments in which any woman would feel robbed of the right to breathe. When the police played the most critical video, the room fell silent. His face twisted with rage, his eyes burning through anything he saw as a threat to his control. But what sent chills down everyone's spine was the isolated audio, a single sentence from him, rasped out with enough weight to pull every suspicion into a long, buried spiral of violence. The husband immediately objected, slamming his hand on the table as if he wanted to break it. He said it was just a misunderstanding, a moment of losing control, something not enough to condemn a man once seen as the light hit at an angle. The engraving appeared clearer, like a forgotten message resurfacing. A symbol, a date, and a line of text that only two people in the world could understand. When the wife saw the ring, she froze. Their son, the boy who had witnessed far more than any adult ever realized. He was the only one who understood how his mother hid her fear, how his father changed over the years, how many times she locked herself in a room just to breathe for a few seconds. But the twist didn't lie there. The twist came when police reviewed traffic cameras near the scene on the night of the incident. Among hundreds of frames that seemed meaningless, they found a small, staggering figure running from the area. Its movements frantic, terrified. When they zoomed in, they saw something no one wanted to believe. It was their son. The quiet boy who always stood behind his mother. The child who never once dared to look his violent father in the eye. The wife collapsed upon hearing the news, not because she believed her son was guilty, but because she realized how vast the darkness must have been for him. To erase himself from every question for so long. He hadn't run away out of fear of being caught. He ran because he was terrified of his own memories, terrified of a night he couldn't bring himself to speak about. When they found him at a beach over 30 miles away, he trembled as officers approached. And in that moment, the final twist cracked open. He hadn't killed anyone. He had only tried to stop his father in one of those rages he knew would fall on his mother. In the struggle, he was shoved into a metal shelf, causing objects to crash down. That noise, the violent clang that shook the room, made the father believe an intruder had broken in, pushing him into a panic he couldn't pull back from. And just seconds later, tragedy unfolded. But the real twist, the one that tightened the heart, was the boy's trembling confession. He had tried to run out of the house to get help, but when he returned, it was already too late. He wasn't the perpetrator, but he was the only witness to the quiet collapse of an entire family. The investigation team stood silent. No one had expected the ending to come from a child, from a heart too young to understand right and wrong, yet burdened with a memory heavy enough to change the trajectory of 3 lives forever. The final truth accused no one. It simply exposed the wounds that family had buried for too long. And in that moment, the narrator could only wonder, with a voice tightened like the listener's own, whether sometimes the real crime isn't the act itself, but the years of silence that nurtured the tragedy. When the police lights finally faded from that quiet street, when the yellow tape was removed and the homes regained their fragile peace, the town could no longer return to what it once was. Some stories leave invisible scratches in the air, slowing the steps of anyone passing by that house, as if listening for something still trapped in the wind. The father's death, the child's panic, the mother's painful silence. All of it fused into an echo that made everyone reflect on their own households. People always say America has houses prettier than paintings, safe neighborhoods with white fences and front yard gardens. But no one ever knows how many lives behind those bright windows are being suffocated by fears they never dare to speak aloud. The mother finally spoke to the police on a long, sun-soaked afternoon. She admitted she had lived in silence for far too many years. Not because she didn't understand what was happening, but because she believed she could endure just a little longer, just one more day, one more week to keep the illusion of a complete family for her son. What she didn't realize was that her endurance was the very thing pushing him deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape alone. When she left the interrogation room, she didn't cry. Many people in town gave her gentle embraces, not accusing, not questioning, just offering the quiet compassion of hearts that had known their own family hurts. In a place full of American traditions, neighborly barbecues, church gatherings, Sunday dinners, they understood that sometimes what a person needs isn't advice, but someone standing close enough to keep them from falling apart. The boy was moved to live with distant relatives so he could begin therapy. He didn't speak much, but whenever someone mentioned his mother, his eyes softened, as if there was still a small, safe corner inside him that he wanted to protect. Experts believed it would take years for him to heal. But at least now, he no longer had to face everything in the dark. The case closed, but its echo lingered. People started talking more openly about domestic violence, hosting community meetings, adding support hotlines for those trapped in fear, the way the mother once was. Because after everything, everyone realized this tragedy wasn't just one family story. It was a reminder that silence can be more dangerous than the violence it hides. When the narrator ended the story, the voice lowered like a strangled breath. In the deepest place, what stayed wasn't the death, wasn't the twist that stunned everyone. It was the question each listener had to answer for themselves. If we see a neighbor shrinking into themselves, a friend living in quiet fear, or a child who never meets an adult's eyes, will we pause long enough to ask, "Are you okay?"